Hey guys, it's Liz of Consumed by Books, and today I'm here to vlog about the Jane and June read-along. And our book for this Jane and June is Pride and Prejudice. Jane and June is hosted by Misty over at Book Rat, and she's also hosting the read-along. So if you want to learn more about Jane and June or the read-along, then you should go visit her blog, Book Rat. You should also visit it because it's one of my favorites. Today we are discussing the first 17 chapters of Pride and Prejudice, and I'm mainly going to stick to the discussion questions that Misty provided. I am going to be reading my answers off the computer because I thought of more than I thought I might remember. So I do ask that you forgive me for having my computer in here. The printer wasn't working, and it and I are going to have to work out our issues later and have a long talk. But that's a story for another day. So the first question is to talk a little bit about our experiences with Jane and reading Pride and Prejudice. I read 5 of Jane Austen's novels, obviously this one. I've read Sense and Sensibility, Persuasion, Northanger Abbey, and Emma as well. This is my third time reading Pride and Prejudice. I read it once right after my senior year of high school, as I was going to be a freshman in college. I read it my senior year of college, and now I'm reading it again. So it's been about a year and a half since the last time I read it. And I love this book. It is one of my all-time favorites. So I adore the romance in the story, and I expect to adore it again going in. And so far, I am. One of the things that I like so much about rereading this book, because it's a story about how people can change, and about how love can sometimes improve not only your life in general, but it can improve your person. And I like the fact that it also touches on the ideas of forgiveness and love. So that is some of why I love this book. And then Misty asks us to share our impressions of the book so far. What have the highlights been for you? Any favorite parts so far? Least favorite parts? Things we found confusing? I have to say, since this is my third time reading it, and I'm not saying this to brag, but for the most part, all of my confusions have been worked out by now, and I really don't have any least favorite parts of this book. It's brilliant. I do have a favorite quote from Mr. Bennet, which I have to find. So at one point, Mrs. Bennet says, "Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves." "You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least." I just think that's really funny, the way he kind of makes fun of her and says, "Yes, actually I do enjoy annoying you." Another quote that I particularly love in this section of the novel is actually from Mary. "Vanity and pride are different things, though the words are often used synonymously. A person may be proud without being vain. Pride relates more to our opinion of ourselves, vanity to what we would have others think of us." I think that this is a fabulous quotation because it is true, and it also plays a very large role throughout the rest of the novel. And talking about, if a characters have pride or vanity, then it tells us about what they have and what they lack and where they might have room to change. For example, I think that Darcy is a very proud character and that Mary is a very vain character. And I think it's interesting to see how their pride and vanity transforms or doesn't transform throughout the novel. Actually, next I'm going to kind of address questions 3, 4, and 7 all in one. Question 3 is, talk about Austen's characters. What do we think of them? Do any stand out to you? Do we notice new things? Do our favorite characters change with each reread? And also, what do we make of the principal characters so far? Do you relate to any particular characters? And question 7 is about the humor in the novel and what we make of it, so I am going to talk about that here some too. My favorite characters don't particularly change with each reread. I tend to think that Austen's characters are always very well developed, but I don't think that she's an author who exposes them all at once, but instead kind of gives us little bits and pieces throughout the story and adds so that our opinion really changes of them throughout the novel. So I do really adore both Elizabeth and Darcy, but my reasons for adoring them are kind of spoilery, and I'm actually going to get into that in later videos. I love how opinionated Elizabeth can be, but I also feel that sometimes she is so focused on her own opinion that she doesn't really see the opinions of others. I wouldn't say she's closed-minded so much as maybe sometimes she is a little bit single-minded. Okay, so I also love, as you can already tell, Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet, and Lydia. And the reason that I love them is because I think that they carry a lot of the humor in the book. Mrs. Bennet and Lydia are both very ridiculous. Mrs. Bennet is constantly running around, and she stresses in a very big way about the eligible men in the area and who her daughters will marry and all of that kind of stuff. And Lydia really, I think, feeds off of that. Lydia is very concerned with what officers in town and what are the newest clothes that she can buy. She's a little bit, I want to say, materialistic. Yeah, I think that's a good word to describe Lydia. And the reason that I love Mr. Bennet is because throughout the novel, he just has a tendency to sit back and sort of quietly mock the rest of his family. Just kind of like with this comment about Mrs. Bennet's nerves. Let's see, sorry. So another thing that I find very interesting that I notice more about Mrs. Bennet with the rereads is that Austen is actually a tiny bit mean to her. She kind of says that Mr. Bennet is fatigued with the raptures of his wife, like, oh my gosh, it is exhausting to be married to this woman. And while that is funny, you have to admit that it is also just a little bit mean. As for some of the other sisters, like Jane, I think that Jane can sometimes be a little bit too much of a doormat, but in some ways, I think that she maybe feels, it's hard, okay, so obviously, like we've said, Lydia and Mrs. Bennet are very overwhelming, and it's hard to say if Jane's character is more of the quieter doormat type, much more subdued with her emotions, is because Austen deliberately created her that way, or if it's like, you know, Jane is sitting there going, my family is crazy, so I just kind of want to stay out of it. So, I don't know, what do you guys think of that? Do you think that Jane's character, that she inherently tries to be quiet, or that Austen just created her that way because she needed more quiet characters? I would really like to know your thoughts on this. Let's see. Another thing that I notice about Elizabeth more with each reread is the fact that she really does assume that Mr. Bingley knows exactly what is going on in Jane's head throughout the romance. And before I just kind of thought Elizabeth was like, you know, kind of thinking in her head, oh, of course Mr. Bingley knows, but now I notice that she actually does kind of say, like, of course Mr. Bingley knows how you feel, don't worry about it. And another thing that I continue to notice, or that I'm noticing now, is that the Bingley sisters just get snobbier and snobbier with each read. I dislike them less and less as I go along. And lastly, again, I really noticed that it was Mary who was talking about the comment with vanity, and that she is very vain and that she kind of thinks, crap, I am ugly, I need to get really good at the piano so that I can find a husband. And that leads us to a brilliant segue into question 5, discuss the eligible men of Pride and Prejudice. I'm going to start with Mr. Collins. So Mr. Collins is very attached to the estate because he is the inheritor, because of the entail. One thing that I largely noticed about his character is that, so he's a clergyman, but he is quite possibly more devoted to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, his patroness, than he is to the church, because he's always talking about how brilliant she is, and he's very overeager. I would say that he's someone who's very vain as well. He cares a lot about what other people think of him, and when I say other people, I mean Lady Catherine de Bourgh. So as for Bingley, I do like him. I think that he is an upstanding character. He is a very kind man. But he can also be a bit of a doormat to his sisters, and I think that is his biggest fault. I think everyone can acknowledge that. And for me, okay, so the thing is that he's nice and he's a doormat to his sister. I feel like he doesn't really have much more going for his character besides those two things, and that's why I don't love him as much as I love some other Austen men. As for Wickham, he is a charming man, but I don't trust him. More on that in just a couple of minutes. And as with Darcy, I really do love him, even at this point in the novel, because yes, he is a jerk, yes, he is a snob, but the thing is, he's also at least able, in a couple moments, able to admit in his own head that he has some admiration for Elizabeth. And I think this is a really admirable trait, not just, you know, in an eligible bachelor, but in a person, because I think that, you know, being able to admit, you know, I admire this person, being honest with yourself, is one of the first steps to being truly happy in life. So I like him because even though he's not there yet, he is at least starting to, you know, deal with all of his emotions. And I'm going to shut this door really quick because someone's watching TV. Yes, the next question. Discuss the Bennet girls' stay at Netherfield. Anyways, so yes, in some ways it is very humorous that Mrs. Bennet's like, hey, Jane, you need to go out in the pouring rain and spend the night at Netherfield and get cozy with the Bingleys. But this is actually a lot more serious than it seems, because this is not a time of modern medicine. This book is set in the 1800s. It would have been very easy for Jane to die of a cold had it gotten really serious. So in some ways, it also really shows just how desperate Mrs. Bennet is and how urgent she believes the situation to be. And I think this visit is when we first start to see how stuck up Mr. Darcy can appear. Because yes, like I said, he does kind of at times admit to himself that he is interested in Elizabeth. But he also talks about everything that he hopes to have in a wife eventually. Like, you know, she has to be well-read, she has to paint, she has to draw, she has to be a great musician, excuse me. She has to be very good at all of these things. And I think that a lot of the traits that he seeks are traits that he is more likely to find in a woman who is very wealthy. And I have to say, I'm not sure that he particularly expects finding these traits in a woman of, say, the Bennet standing. I'm not really sure about that, I could be wrong, but I just think it suggests an inclination, again, towards the higher classes. I think Caroline Bingley is kind of evil during this visit, because after a couple of hours, she kind of starts to ignore Jane, who is really sick, and be like, oh, they're imposing. And she's just so interested in social climbing and getting the big estate for herself and being wealthy that she really pays all of her attention to Darcy. And I actually have to admit that during this visit, I think Elizabeth comes close to committing some social faux pas, because she just spends so much time with Jane. Like, she's in her room a lot of the time she's there, except for in the evenings, and I just have to wonder if it maybe would have been polite if she'd spent a couple more hours with the Bingleys, considering that her sister basically lives in their house for a short period of time. I could be wrong, but there you go. And next up, we are to discuss Wickham's revelations of Darcy's character, and the point of this question is to judge on the text, and not based on past reads, what we think of Wickham and do we believe the things that he tells Lizzie. And frankly, no, I don't believe Wickham, and here are the reasons. Number one, Lizzie has just met him. It seems a little weird that she would immediately dive right into trusting his opinions. And number two is that even as they're sitting there talking about Darcy, she sits there and goes, wait, Darcy is friends with Bingley, and Bingley is great. Does Bingley know that he's friends with such a terrible person? And you'd think that for most people that would be kind of a light bulb, like, well, I know Bingley better, so maybe I should, you know, trust more what Bingley says and be a little bit dubious about what Wickham is telling me. This incident has a tendency to make me realize how quick to judge Elizabeth can be, and it kind of, I think, shows her temper, because she is so annoyed with how Mr. Darcy has treated her that she's just like, whatever, I'll believe anyone that anyone says against him. As for Darcy, it doesn't really change my opinion too much of him, the way he treats Mr. Wickham. I think it just kind of reaffirms the fact that he can be sort of aloof. And the last question is to discuss the humor in the book. I already talked a little bit about the humor of Mrs. Bennet and Lydia being ridiculous and Mr. Bennet just sitting there going, yep, you guys are crazy. And to be frank, I kind of enjoy getting on your nerves. I think Mr. Collins is another huge part of the humor in this novel. And I think that this is partially because he is so eager to win over one of the Bennet sisters because he feels bad about the entail. But also, even Mr. Bennet is sitting there going, wow, this guy is just as ridiculous as I always thought. Yes, this is awesome. And as for the humor in Elizabeth's comments, I do like the fact that the humor kind of helps other people maybe see their own faults a little bit. And it also does kind of, you know, spark conversation, like, what does Darcy admire in a woman? Things like that. That being said, I do think that in this part of the book especially, for a lot of it, really, her humor does get overshadowed by how ridiculous the rest of her family is being. So yeah, other than that, I don't immediately have a ton to add on this, but rest assured that I will have lots more thoughts to share with you next time, as always. And get excited for future vlogs, because soon there are going to be comparisons made between Lady Catherine de Bourgh and Donald Trump, and I know you all are looking forward to that. So again, this was my recap of chapters 1 through 17 of Pride and Prejudice, and if you want to learn more about the read-along, you should go to Misty's vlog, and I'm going to peace out. Happy reading, everyone!